The Fairey IIIF was the third most produced British aircraft of the interwar period. Until emergency production of the Hurricane started in 1936 and 37, only the Hawker Hart series were more numerous. Yet we remember the glamorous and rapid Hart and have essentially forgotten the 3F. It was an unglamorous aircraft, and one that evolved quite gradually rather than emerging fully formed from the mind of a design genius. The original Fairey IIIA was an early attempt at a carrier reconnaissance platform. It was powered by a 260 horsepower Sunbeam Maori 2 engine, and it was a two-bay equal-span biplane with a fabric skin stretched over a wooden frame. 50 of them were built and supplied to the home fleet before the armistice, and they were all withdrawn by 1919. Its successor, the 3B, replaced wheels with 3 floats, 2 main ones and a tail, and it had fittings for up to 250 pounds of bombs. The 3B also adopted a late-war biplane design convention and extended the span of the top wing. Otherwise, it was quite unremarkable. 30 were built before the close of hostilities, and they were deployed to coastal bases in the Channel. Although quite few in number, the 3B was popular with pilots, who valued its rugged construction. The different-sized wings were, however, less successful, and the 3C reverted to equal lengths. Sponson floats were added below the wingtips for stability during turns. Equally significant was the conversion to Rolls-Royce Eagle power, in this case the 375 horsepower Mark 8. One of these aircraft reached Great Yarmouth before the armistice, and it was eventually joined by 5 aircraft converted from 3Bs and 30 new builds. The new builds went to Archangel aboard the HMS Pegasus, and they were used in raids against the Bolsheviks. Eagles would also power most of the 3D series, which served the Navy as a wheeled land plane equipped with axle-mounted hooks for use with deck wires, and as a conventional seaplane. Later members of the production run switched to the 450 horsepower Napier Lion, which proved more able than the Eagle to deliver the predictable power needed in a carrier fighter. The stage was thus set for the Fairey IIIF. 595 of these would be built in 4 marks for the Fleet Air Arm and the RAF in a run that lasted from 1926 to 1932. The Fleet Air Arm's 3Fs began to be delivered in 1926. They were 3-seaters carrying a pilot, observer and a radio operator, who also manned the defensive Lewis gun. Power came from a Lion 5A. The earliest examples of this type had an unusual stepped tail in place of the straight line one on the Flycatcher. Sometime in the production run, this would be replaced by an elliptical curve. 32 Mark IIs followed, but the definitive carrier version was the Mark III. This shifted to an all-metal structure from the composite wood and metal of earlier versions. 269 Mark IIIs were built. Of these, 79 were strengthened 3Bs for use with catapults, and 10 were dual-control trainers. The Fairey IIIF was quite a large carrier aircraft for the time. It had a span of 45 feet and 9 inches, attached to a fuselage 34 feet 4 inches long. It weighed just under 4,000 pounds empty and 6,300 fully loaded. It was thus literally twice the weight of a Flycatcher fighter. Weight obviously kept performance to modest levels. Despite having a 570 horsepower Napier Lion, top speed was just 120 miles per hour, at a time when the fastest fighters were capable of over 140. Armament was a single fixed 303 Vickers for the pilot and the radio operator's Lewis gun on either a scarf ring or a Fairey high-speed mount. As well as the guns, up to 500 pounds of bombs could be carried. It was a large and comfortable aircraft to fly with a sizable cockpit. Pilots remarked that they felt like they were sitting in the middle of a very large aeroplane, remote from the wings, struts, the engine, and so on. When the motor was running, it did so with the implacable, unstressed rumbling that only a slow-turning engine of 24 litres can deliver. The same engine was used for long-endurance demonstration flights in the late 20s, and it demonstrated how it could run to many tens of thousands of engine miles without breakdowns. The earlier, less powerful versions of the Lion were a bit smoother than the 9A, but there was no appreciable difference in reliability. The Fairey III was heavily built throughout, and it showed it. Acrobatic it was not, but with a long fuselage and large tail and elevator surfaces, it had impeccable longitudinal stability. With a bit of a run-up, it could be coaxed into a loop. Although it spun quite easily if a stall could be provoked, it would also recover quickly and easily. Easy is also the right way to describe its behaviour behind the ship. Approach speed was just 44 knots, so if the carrier had 15 knots or so of wind over the deck, the landing was a relaxed and leisurely affair even without arrestor wires. Predictably, the landing gear was very strong. The only thing that RAF pilots had to be careful with was slamming the heavy Fairey down in desert sand. The wings would sink quite some distance, accompanied by flying sand and bent propeller blades. It wasn't until 1928 that enough Fairies had been built up in naval stocks to be used operationally. They first went to sea on Glorious, and they would serve on all of the Navy's carriers on stations from Scotland to China. Fairey III's last went to sea on Furious in 1936, but the type actually wasn't declared obsolete until 1940. At least one was present as a target tug in Hong Kong when the Japanese attacked in 1941, and others performed that role back home in Britain throughout the war. In the 30s, 3 surplus aircraft were modified with radio controls as the Fairey Queen. This was an early example of a target drone, and they were expended as targets for the Mediterranean fleet at Gibraltar. Seaplane versions of the Fairey IIIF served on most large Royal Navy capital ships until they were replaced by Ospreys in 1932. They were also deployed to stations around the Empire, as in this lovely photo of a 3 being craned out into the Nile at Khartoum in 1932. The floatplane version was also easy to fly. It was stable in the water and controllable when taxiing, even in quite strong winds. Takeoffs and landings were therefore easy to execute. Floatplane spins were, however, slightly more tricky, requiring at least 1,500 feet of altitude to successfully recover from. The RAF also flew the 3F extensively. Their Mark IV actually arrived into service before the Navy's Mark I. RAF aircraft only had 2 seats. Their ruggedness, reliability, and range meant that they were used across the Empire as a reconnaissance and mapping aircraft. At the end of the run, the RAF also received an all-metal version of the aircraft that increased strength even more. Such was the regard in which they were held in that, at the end of their useful lives, many were rebuilt as Fairey Gordons with uprated engines and different tail units. It was an unglamorous but much-loved aeroplane, one of the last of the old breed.